Hi guys, so when we ended the last chapter, the last paragraph said, with those words, I don't have my glasses on, be right back. Hey guys, when we ended the last chapter, it ended with this paragraph. With those words, George Washington, the 43-year-old Virginia gentleman, rode north to take command of the colonial army outside British-occupied Boston. It was June 17, 1775. The next chapter, Chapter 9, The American Revolution. During the journey, a messenger brought Washington news of a major battle between the British Redcoats and the New England militia. This was the Battle of Breed's Hill, often called Bunker Hill by mistake, outside Boston. The Redcoats won, but failed to stop the siege of Boston that had been mounted by the New Englanders. See, there they are in camp with their tents. When Washington arrived at his command post near Boston, he found the morale of the New Englanders militia to be high since their excellent performance at the Battle of Breed's Hill. This situation added to the resentment between the northern and southern colonies that had risen when George Washington, a Virginian, was chosen as commander of the Continental Army. Despite the presence of some brave men among its ranks, the army that awaited George Washington's leadership was not an impressive force. Most of the men were untrained volunteers, farmers and hunters, with no military experience. Before long, they missed their families and their farms, and often returned home without telling their officers they were leaving. Discipline was terrible. Far from acting as a single unit with team spirit, the troops behaved as individuals. Not only was there friction between Northerners and Southerners, even soldiers from the same region seemed to dislike each other. Each New England colony, for example, regarded itself as separate and distinct from its neighbors. Washington wrote in his diary, "Connecticut wants no Massachusetts man in their corps. Massachusetts thinks there is no need for Rhode Island men to serve among them, and New Hampshire says that her valuable and experienced officers should not be dismissed." Then the governing bodies of some of the colonies wanted permission for their troops to remain in their home territories. When he arrived to take command of the army, Washington couldn't even determine how many men were available. Instead of the 20,000 troops he had anticipated, there turned out to only be 14,000 troops. The supply of weapons and other equipment was similarly far short of what he expected. A member of Washington's staff informed him that someone had miscounted the number of barrels of gunpowder. Instead of 485, there were only 38 barrels. When I heard this bad news, I felt like exploding with rage, Washington later confided to a friend. Instead, I controlled my anger and simply remained speechless. Washington realized that the enormous task at hand, preparing his army to wage war against the British, did not allow time for temper to rule him. Even now, he was indeed becoming wiser as his military responsibilities increased. Washington exercised great patience throughout this period of transforming his unruly mob of men into a trained and disciplined military force. He had to deal with fierce rivalries among the colonies in deciding which men would receive officers' rank. Recruitment of soldiers was also a major problem. The Virginia Assembly, for one, complained that the colony would go bankrupt if it had to raise and supply the 3,000 soldiers that Washington required. Still, another quarrelsome issue was the Continental Congress's insistence on approving officers commissions, and appointments to the senior ranks of the Army. Corresponding with Congress on such issues used up valuable time that Washington needed for military strategy. Instead of making the necessary arrangements to fortify New York, plan for an invasion of Canada, and be ready to repel attacks by hostile Indians whose activities were backed by British support, Washington had to waste priceless hours with paperwork. The new commander-in-chief devoted all his boundless energy into the revolutionary effort, just as he had with every other task he had ever undertaken in his life. Other colonial leaders, by contrast, seemed to lack a sense of duty to volunteer for military service. Patrick Henry, for example, made fiery speeches against the British rule, but quit the Army when he was not made a senior officer. Finally, on March 4, 1776, Washington was ready to launch an attack against Boston, which was heavily fortified by the British occupation forces. He led 3,000 troops against the 9,000-man British force and succeeded in driving the enemy out of his city. But the war continued. England sent fresh troops to America, and despite strong resistance from Washington's army, they captured New York. Washington's troops often didn't have enough guns, uniforms, food, or blankets, but the soldiers were brave and loyal to their leader. They admired Washington for his quick mind and his clever strategies. He knew when to attack and when to retreat. George Washington was not a so-called armchair general who remained safely back in his headquarters and issued orders to the men on the battlefield. He was a hands-on commander, participating fully in all the campaigns. He shared all the hardships of his men, suffering cold and hunger and fatigue along with them. He also praised his troops frequently in order to strengthen their morale. Despite his best efforts, Washington faced an almost impossible task in recruiting and maintaining a strong army. There simply were not enough qualified officers and men available. We need a 50,000-man army in which each man enlists for a long period, preferably 3 years, Washington advised the Continental Congress. No, came the reply. A large standing army could result in a military dictatorship, Washington was told. This struggle was for a democratic America governed by the representatives of the people, not for a country based on the power of the army and one-man rule of a general. The year 1776 held a string of military dilemmas for the Americans. Faced with these obstacles, even a courageous leader like George Washington couldn't win battles with an army of raw recruits. The fearful behavior and incompetence of these experienced soldiers was almost too much for Washington to bear. At Kips Bay, New York, for example, 2 brigades of the Connecticut militia, 4,000 men in all, fled at the sight of an advance guard of 100 lightly armed redcoats. Washington could not control his emotions. He flung his hat to the ground and shouted, "How am I supposed to defend America with men such as these?" As officers raced past him in panic, he struck out with them in frustration with a cane whip. Then Washington, still on his horse, found himself alone on the battlefield, roaring with rage. The redcoats were barely 100 yards away. They could have seized him in a flash, but they were confused by seeing an unguarded American general and suspected a trap. Finally, one of Washington's aides approached, grabbed the horse's bridle, and escorted the commander to safety. Here's an illustration of him alone on the battlefield. Sounds like he was getting angry. Guys, I got to have a sip of water real quick. So George Washington is getting angry. Goodness, Excuse me. This incident showed the intensity that lay not too far beneath Washington's usual calm surface. George Washington was so extraordinarily brave, even reckless, in the face of danger that he could not understand or sympathize with fear and cowardice in other men. Thus, although he usually behaved like a gentleman, the sight of cowards touched a nerve in him. The Indians had recognized this streak of rage in Washington's personality when they gave him the name Conoticarius. Washington struggled through his life to curb his own tendency to strike out in anger. He fought to control himself in a manner similar to his struggle to tame the many wild horses he had broken. To an amazing extent, he succeeded. He was motivated by the fact that his goal was greater than himself alone. It was the liberation of America from England and the colony's birth as a free nation. On July 4th, 1776, the delegates of the Second Continental Congress signed the Declaration of Independence, which stated that the colonies were free and independent states. This act turned the rebellion of the colonies into a full-scale war. The 13 colonies became 13 states. Philadelphia became the capital of the new nation. The Liberty Bell rang out and echoed all across America. 5 days after signing of the Declaration, Washington's 23,000-man army faced a 30,000-strong force in New York Harbor. The British inflicted such heavy losses on Washington's forces that troops were reduced to 7,000 people. New York City was in flames, and what was left of Washington's army retreated across the Hudson River into New Jersey, with the Redcoats in hot pursuit. Washington's army continued to decline. The promise of a free America seemed to be fading quickly. The Continental Congress, fearing a British invasion of Philadelphia, fled the new capital in a panic. Forgotten was the Congress's fear of military dictatorship. As 1776 drew to a close, George Washington was given virtual dictatorial powers. The Congress authorized him to call up troops and wage military campaigns at the times and places of his choosing. This one action saved the country. Washington divided his remaining forces, putting 4,500 men along the Hudson River to protect New England and about 2,500 in Philadelphia. Shortly before Christmas in 1776, while a snowstorm raged, the second band of ragged soldiers left Philadelphia under Washington's command and crossed the ice-filled Delaware River. The objective was to launch a surprise attack against Trenton, New Jersey, while hired Hessian troops were asleep in their encampment there. The Hessians from Germany fought on England's side in the war. Washington sent an urgent message to Congress for money to pay spies. Within a few days, he recruited John Honeyman, a former British soldier who secretly favored the Americans' cause. Washington had Honeyman act as an American defecting to the Hessians. To cover up Honeyman's true role, Washington issued a proclamation denouncing the defection and offering a reward for Honeyman's arrest. Meanwhile, loyal Americans were told to take the traitor alive because George Washington wanted personally to hang him. Honeyman, one of the cleverest agents of the war, made friends with the Hessian commander, had confidential talks with him, and closely observed every detail of Trenton's defenses. Honeyman, according to plan, arranged to be captured by an American patrol. He then passed on to Washington all the valuable information he had gathered. To keep Honeyman's activities believable, Washington ordered guards to put Honeyman in a cell and prepare for his hanging. Then, given the keys to a cell, Honeyman escaped, returning to the Hessians, and told them that the Americans were badly disorganized and barely capable of fighting. This clever trick probably spelled the difference between success and failure at Trenton. The Hessians were merely This clever trick probably spelled the difference between success and failure at Trenton. The Hessians were merrily celebrating Christmas when Washington's forces attacked that night. They captured 900 Hessian prisoners of war, hundreds of weapons, and a storehouse of supplies. Here they are, an illustration of the Hessians celebrating Christmas. Lord Cornwallis, one of England's most distinguished military commanders, rushed with his forces to New Jersey, but was outsmarted by Washington. In another brilliant midnight strike, Washington's forces marched 23 miles to Princeton, New Jersey, and destroyed 3 British regiments. Lord Cornwallis found himself staring at the empty American camp in Trenton. Washington's legendary fearlessness was displayed once again in the beginning of the Princeton campaign. Washington, telling his soldiers the British were not good marksmen, ordered them to form a line along the entire length of the regiment and open fire. Washington himself sat at his horse between the British and American lines as they exchanged gunfire. It was a miracle he wasn't killed. When the British fled, Washington, accompanied by a single aide, pursued them. Though he intended to surround and capture the enemy, his own troops were nowhere in sight. That was my coffee pot beeping. The battle at Princeton illustrated not only Washington's skill and courage, but also his generous nature. In sharp comparison with the fierce hatreds that marked rival armies in later centuries, Washington felt no personal hate toward the Redcoats. In fact, he displayed remarkable kindness toward the prisoners and wounded men on the British side. At the end of the Princeton campaign, Washington came upon several American soldiers robbing an injured British fighter. He angrily drove the thieves away and ordered an aide to stand guard over the bleeding man until an American doctor arrived. On another occasion, Washington persuaded the Continental Congress to permit British General John Burgoyne, whom the Americans had taken prisoner at the Battle of Saratoga, to return to England on parole to defend himself against his critics in the British Parliament. Washington wrote Burgoyne a letter of sympathy, "With your feelings as a soldier." Burgoyne read it to the Parliament, declaring that, although it was written by an enemy, it did credit to the human heart. The victories at Trenton and Princeton marked an important upward turn for America, but did not end the war. Washington soon withdrew with his army to Morristown, New Jersey, to spend the remainder of the winter. Here's an illustration. He was always on his guard, however. Along the main road, he distributed his men 2 and 3 to a house for miles, thus creating an impression that he had a sizable army. In fact, his troop strength was only 4,500, compared with 27,000 redcoats. During the stay in Morristown, a person claiming to be a businessman appeared in the American camp and loudly proclaimed his hatred of the English. Washington immediately suspected that the man was a spy. He ordered his aides to prepare figures on the army's strength, figures that were greatly exaggerated. Then he invited the stranger to his headquarters for dinner. After the meal, an aide, by the prearranged signal, called Washington into the next room. Washington left the list of figures purposely unguarded on a table. Sure enough, the spy hurried to read the figures, which were printed on official paper and saying there were more than 12,000 American troops at Morristown. The next morning, the spy returned to New York to convey his information to General William Howe, the British commander. Howe decided that he dared not attack such a large American army. Washington's troops thus survived to fight another day. And here's an illustration that says the spy is returning to General Howe. And I believe that is the end of chapter 9. Does anybody know what happened next? Well, chapter 10's clue is in the title. The title of chapter 10 is Victory with an exclamation mark. Can you guys see that? Victory with an exclamation mark. And that's going to be our chapter for tomorrow, guys. We're down to chapters 10 and 11. We're getting close to the end of our book.